Good afternoon, everybody. It is Tuesday, October 21st, and I'm Ty Benbow, pastor at the Kindred Church of Kansas City. And this is another sermon recap. We're going to go over the sermon from Sunday, the 19th of October, where we covered Mark chapter 13, verses 28 through 37. This is the final section of Jesus's Olivet discourse. And so we're closing out Mark chapter 13. And in so doing, what we need to realize is what the immediate context was for really the entire chapter of Mark 13. So if you recall, Mark 13 opens. It was like a month ago, so that's why I say if you recall, because we've been in it for just a minute. Mark 13, 1 and 2, the very beginning of the chapter, you have an unnamed disciple of Jesus who's like, Lord, look at these buildings. Look at these magnificent stones. Like, isn't this complex incredible? Talking about the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. And Jesus says, not one stone is going to be left on top of another. So Jesus calls for the complete and imminent destruction of the temple of Yahweh, which makes a lot of sense given what Jesus had done in the temple complex earlier and what he had to say about it. And so anyway, that led four disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, to approach Jesus and ask him, what's going on? And that was Mark 13, verse 4, which reads, tell us, when will these things be? And what will the sign be when all these things are about to be accomplished? So the immediate context of the Olivet Discourse, the first thing it's about are those initial catalytic remarks Jesus made about the destruction of the temple. So as the historical look of this chapter spreads out, the thing we're looking at here is the context of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple of Yahweh, which any historian knows occurred in 70 AD at the hands of the Roman Empire. So Jesus was speaking in advance of something we know happened. And so that's really important. And so what we get out of this, especially when we start to look at specifically what we covered on Sunday in the sermon, is if you look at verse 28, Jesus says, from the fig tree, learn its lesson, which of course is supposed to hearken us back to Mark chapter 11, verse 21, where Peter, when they're leaving the city again after Jesus has cleansed the temple, goes, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed, it's withered up, right? And so Jesus is like, do you remember the fig tree? Do you remember it having been withered after I cursed it? Now you see what all of that was alluding to. And one of the things I covered on Sunday is just understanding the gravity of Jesus's predictions and how important it is that he was right about it. Within approximately 40 years of everything Jesus said, the following ensued. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman Empire. The temple of Yahweh was razed completely, not one stone on top of another. It's still like that today. The church began to experience widespread growth and widespread persecution, even before the destruction of Jerusalem and the raising of the temple. So all of those things happened. And so one of the things we talked about, my sermon on Sunday was a 2-point sermon. It wasn't any shorter than any other sermon, but it was 2 points. And point number one was this: Christians rest easy in Jesus's promises because he has an ability to see what is coming. He knows. And so Jesus proved in the Olivet Discourse that when he says something's going to happen, we can trust that it will because he's done it. More specifically, in what ways has Jesus done it? Well, he's done it in more ways than one. And so one of the things that I think it's really important for us to reflect on in retrospect of the sermon on Sunday is, what all did Jesus get right? And the answer is a lot. And so let's just walk through everything Jesus was right about. He was right regarding his own life, his own passion, and his own death and resurrection. He was right about the end of Jerusalem. He was right about the raising of the temple. He was right about the fate of Israel. And he was right about the birth of the church and the growth and persecution it would experience in that first century. So he's been right about everything. And so the first thing we talked about on Sunday is this understanding that Christians get to rest easy on the promises of Jesus. When he says something, it happens. If he says it about himself, if he says it about Jerusalem, if he says it about Israel, if he says it about the temple, if he says it about the church, it happens. And so the first half of the sermon was, even if it's bad news, you can rest easy in the fact that Jesus is right. When he says something's going to happen, it will. And then the second half of the sermon, which was equally important, was talking about this second contextual piece. Throughout the Olivet Discourse, there's this, at least to me, real clear demarcation between when Jesus is speaking about the immediate things that are going to happen, specific to the disciples, and when things are going to happen later that are in some way, shape, or form related to the thing he first started talking about. And so the way we talked about this on Sunday is that verses 28 through 31 in this past Sunday sermon directly correspond to verses 14 through 23 of Jesus's earlier remarks in the Olivet Discourse. All of those verses 14 through 23, and then 28 through 31, all relate to the immediate destruction of Jerusalem and the raising of the temple and the end of the Jewish age and the end of the nation of Israel proper. All of that is what Jesus is talking about. But then, interestingly enough, twice in the midst of those predictions, Jesus pivots and he begins to talk about what can only be seen as something else. Verses 24 through 27, and then verses 32 through 37, he begins to speak about something else entirely. He begins to start speaking about his final and triumphant return. And that's where we ended on Sunday. We ended on this notion of what Jesus references as that day. And so you get some understanding here that when Jesus starts to speak to that day, he's speaking about the end of time. He's speaking about the end of history. He's not just speaking about the end of an age. He's speaking about the end of human history as we've come to understand it. He's talking about the arrival of the kingdom of heaven in totality, when a new heaven and a new earth will emerge in our existence. And so what we start to get into is this understanding that Jesus finishes with something that doesn't immediately impact the four men he's talking to. And the reason we know that is because Jesus literally says as much. He says, this message is for you and for all. Stay awake, stay alert. And so you get the idea is he's just not telling Peter, Andrew, James, and John that they need to stay alert. He's telling everyone across time and space that they need to remain alert. And then he starts to talk about what it's like when the master leaves the house and no one knows when he's going to come back. So this is clearly something that's going to affect more than just the disciples. It's going to affect Christendom as a whole. And that's where we're at today. And so my second and last point on Sunday was the following. The Christian is to, one, rest easy in Jesus's promises and remain alert to the fulfillment of his promises, which is his final return. So Jesus was right in his predictions, and he's going to be right in his final prediction, which is when he comes home. And the interesting thing here is this leads to a new exhortation for Christians today. And that is that we must determine not to know the end of time. Jesus has said we're not going to know. We need to trust him that we won't. Because one of the great temptations is for people to say, I know he's coming now. Like, it's certainly going to come now. And it's like, no. It's not your job to accurately predict his return. It's to stay alert for when he does. That's it. Your job is not to prognosticate and guess or predict when he's going to come back. Your job is to be ready when he does, to stay alert, to stay awake, to stay sober. And what's interesting about this is that this is an inversion to what happened with Adam and Eve. And in the garden, Adam and Eve were commanded not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they have a situation, they're to remain content in it, and they're to remain content in not knowing something. Instead, they take the knowledge or the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they eat, and now they know something, they know shame. And so the irony here is that we are to follow in the pattern of the second Adam, which is Jesus, in determining not to know. It's not our job to know when Jesus is coming back. Our job is to be prepared for when he does. And the irony here is 3 times in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says this in today's section alone. In verse 33, verse 35, and verse 37, 3 times Jesus says, stay awake. And so the implication is that's exactly what the Christian is supposed to do. And again, back to the brilliance of the way the Gospels are patterned. Here you have Jesus telling the disciples, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. And I can hear someone asking, well, hang on, I thought this was for the future. Why would he tell them to stay awake? It's interesting you ask that. It's because very soon in the Garden of Gethsemane, what are the disciples going to continue to do? Jesus is going to tell them to stay awake and keep watch. And 3 times he's going to have to tell them to get up. And so he's telling them stay awake because in their time, they're going to need to stay awake. And he's telling us to stay awake because in our time, we're supposed to stay awake. And so that's the encouragement that we left Christians with on Sunday. That on one hand, we can rest easy in the fact that Jesus's promises have been proven to be true. When he says something's going to happen, it will. And on the second half of that promise is our expectation that we are to remain alert, we're to remain awake and ready, so that when he comes, it's not a surprise, and we can rest easy in these promises. So that was Sunday. We have wrapped up the Olivet Discourse, a challenging but filling section of the Gospel of Mark. And on Thursday, we will begin our exploration of Mark chapter 14. The first 11 verses of which I will preach next Sunday. So between now and then, God bless you. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you all on Thursday. See you then.